The rain poured like the heavens were mourning with her, cold droplets soaking through Ariella Monroe's thin sweater as she stood frozen on the slick sidewalk, mascara streaking down her cheeks like ink bleeding from a broken soul. Her fingers trembled around the soaked phone, still displaying Preston's cruel text. "You're too much, Ariella. I need someone who knows her place." Her breath caught, not from the chill, but from the humiliation clawing at her throat. The man she had loved for 3 years, trusted with her secrets, her dreams, her body, had discarded her like she was inconvenient baggage he forgot to unpack. She had given him everything, molded her life around his ambitions, dimmed her light to fit into the tidy box he demanded of her, and yet it still wasn't enough. She remembered the way his eyes darted as he ended things in front of his friends at the senator's gala, how they laughed behind wine glasses as her world crumbled silently in the corner. She had been the sacrifice for his social climb, the invisible casualty in a game of public appearances and backroom deals, only she hadn't seen it coming, blinded by love that turned out to be a cage. Her heart didn't just break, it unraveled like thread from a wound that would never heal right, dragging her aching body through the unfamiliar streets of downtown Manhattan. She stumbled into the first place she saw with warm lights and silence, the kind of upscale bar where broken people wore expensive pain. The scent of aged whiskey and cedar walls met her as she slumped onto the velvet bar stool, ignoring the curious glances from strangers dressed in money and misery. Her voice shook as she ordered a drink, blinking through the storm behind her eyes, silently praying that the liquor would numb the sting clawing at her ribs. But then, through the blur, her eyes met his. A man across the room, still as winter, eyes the color of a summer sky after a storm. Knox Whitmore. Though she didn't know his name then, there was something haunting about the way he held his glass, like a man used to silence, but not peace. His gaze wasn't predatory, it wasn't pitying, it was still, seeing, understanding. As if he, too, carried 1,000 unsaid things behind those ice-blue eyes. Something in her shifted. Maybe it was the way he didn't look away when everyone else did. Maybe it was the quiet invitation in his stare that said, "You don't have to explain." She didn't ask who he was. She didn't care. That night, she didn't want promises or explanations. She just wanted to feel something that didn't hurt. So when he walked over without a word, when his voice was velvet and unhurried as he asked if she was okay, and she lied, nodding with broken strength, he didn't challenge it. He just sat, ordered another drink. Let the silence speak louder than comfort ever could, and when he gently brushed her damp hair from her face, her defenses cracked. She wasn't the girl who planned one-night stands, wasn't reckless with her body or heart, but grief had its own logic. And so, with trembling hands and burning shame, she let him lead her out of the bar. Not to escape, but to exhale. In the dim light of his penthouse suite, walls painted in shadows and moonlight, he didn't rush, didn't consume. He waited, touched her like a question, not a possession. And for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt seen. Not as Preston's girlfriend, not as the senator's future daughter-in-law, but as Ariella, just Ariella. That night wasn't about lust, it was about freedom, about shedding the ache of being someone else's, too much. She wasn't even sure if she cried during or after, only that when he held her afterward, his breast steady against her shoulder, the silence wasn't empty. It was sacred, and though she still didn't know his name, she knew something unspoken had shifted in her soul. She thought she had ended her story that night, but what she didn't realize was that she had just met the man who would rewrite her life entirely. The morning sun peeked through the sheer curtains, brushing softly against Ariella's bare shoulders as she slowly stirred from sleep. The unfamiliar scent of cedar and expensive cologne still lingering on her skin, like a phantom reminder of the night she had surrendered to numbness and need. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, her gaze landing on the untouched glass of water on the nightstand, the carefully folded blanket at the edge of the bed, and the silent emptiness that now filled the penthouse suite. The man was gone, as quietly as he had entered her life. No note, no goodbye, just shadows and silence. That was how it was meant to be, she told herself. buttoning her coat with shaking hands, brushing away the emotional dust like it never happened. It was supposed to be anonymous, a clean cut, an unspoken agreement between two people too wounded to ask for more. But days later, when she walked into the downtown art gallery where she worked part-time, her world tilted on its axis once again. The air inside buzzed with nervous energy, whispered conversations flooding the space like static. Cameras flashed like stars exploding, assistants moved like ants in crisis, and Ariella, still groggy from her late-night painting session, was about to retreat to the storeroom when a hush fell over the room, thick and immediate. Then she saw him, tall, magnetic, and commanding the room without a single word. He moved with practiced elegance, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that whispered of power, and when their eyes met, her breath stopped. Her heart didn't race, it froze. There, under the gallery's spotlights, stood the man she thought she would never see again, the stranger who held her in the quietest hour of her despair, her silent salvation. But he wasn't just any man. He was Knox Whitmore, the elusive billionaire whose name echoed through Forbes lists and luxury boardrooms across the country. The CEO of Whitmore Holdings, a man who built an empire on secrets, precision, and elegance. Her knees weakened, her mind scrambled to process the impossibility of what stood before her, and in that instant, she realized that what she thought was a fleeting mistake was now colliding with her present reality like a tidal wave. His smirk was subtle, dangerous, knowing. "Funny running into you again, Miss Monroe," he said, his voice smooth as silk but sharp enough to draw blood. The casual way he said her name made it feel anything but casual. Her stomach flipped. He knew her name. She never told him, which meant he knew who she was the entire time. Her mind raced, desperate to stitch together the pieces. Had he planned it? Followed her? Was it all some kind of twisted game? And yet there was no malice in his gaze, just an unreadable intensity that pulled at the edges of her composure. She wanted to run, to hide behind canvas and color and anonymity, but her feet betrayed her. "Why?" was all she could whisper, her voice fragile, barely audible. He tilted his head, amused. "You fascinate me," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And suddenly, the gallery, the cameras, the art, all blurred. In the days since their night together, she had convinced herself she had been a passing shadow in someone else's story. But now she stood at the epicenter of something she couldn't yet define. Her co-workers looked at her, puzzled by the familiarity between the billionaire and the girl who cataloged paint orders. Mira, her best friend, mouthed stunned, "Do you know him?" But Ariella couldn't speak. She felt exposed, like a painting stripped of its frame, raw and unfinished. Knox stepped closer, his presence towering but not oppressive, the faint scent of his cologne instantly dragging her back to that night. The warmth, the quiet, the way his fingertips traced her skin like a secret. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He just looked at her like she was a puzzle he wasn't finished solving. "I'd like to discuss a proposal," he said calmly, as if this were a business meeting and not an emotional ambush. Ariella swallowed hard, struggling to steady the storm inside her. She wanted to scream, to demand answers. But a deeper part of her, one she didn't trust yet, was curious. What kind of man hides behind mystery? Why her? And what exactly did he want now? Her life, once boringly predictable, now spiraled into a story she hadn't written. And deep down, beneath the panic and the questions, something dangerous flickered, the first spark of connection. She had walked away from him that morning believing their story had ended. But now, standing in the middle of her world, he had just reopened a chapter she wasn't ready to face. And there was no turning back. Ariella couldn't sleep for 3 nights after that gallery encounter, her mind a storm of questions and confusion, replaying Knox's piercing blue eyes and calm voice over and over, trying to find the catch, the angle, the trick behind his presence. Because nothing in her life had ever come without conditions, and certainly not from men like him. But when the sleek black car pulled up outside her apartment building that Thursday morning, and the suited assistant handed her a crisp white envelope embossed with a silver W, her trembling fingers couldn't stop themselves from opening it. Inside was a personal invitation to lunch, Not a meeting, not a formality, but something direct, deliberate, signed in Knox Whitmore's own elegant handwriting. She hesitated, pacing her small living room in worn slippers, Mira's voice in her head warning her to be careful, but the part of her that had tasted the gravity of his presence couldn't ignore the pull. When she stepped into the private rooftop restaurant hours later, the skyline was sharp, endless, and terrifyingly beautiful, much like the man waiting for her with quiet intensity and a cup of untouched coffee. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I want you to work with me," he said, sliding a sleek folder across the table with sketches and renderings of a new arts foundation. One focused on underprivileged voices, raw talent, and unapologetic expression. Her name was printed at the top of a proposed consultant list. Ariella blinked, stunned. "Why me?" she whispered, heart pounding. Knox didn't smile. "Because you see the world like it's still worth saving." Those words hit deeper than she expected, unearthing something tender and nearly forgotten inside her. The offer wasn't a handout. It was a challenge, an invitation to become something bigger than her heartbreak. Still, trust didn't come easy. She stared at him, searching for manipulation, waiting for the same mask she'd seen so many men wear when they wanted something wrapped in sweetness. But there was no mask, just a guarded man offering something frighteningly real. Ariella tried to say no. She rehearsed her refusal on the way home, telling herself she wasn't ready, that she didn't belong in marble offices or million-dollar projects, that she was just the girl Preston left for someone shinier. But by the next morning, she found herself emailing her acceptance. Short, hesitant, brave. And so began the unraveling of her quiet life. The first day at Whitmore Holdings was like entering another universe, one with glass walls, whispered power, and cold elegance. Yet amid the order and opulence, there was Knox, an enigma who challenged her with one look and made her pulse race with one question. They worked closely, but never too close, orbiting each other with a tension that simmered under every conversation, every shared silence in the boardroom or elevator. Ariella tried to bury her feelings beneath schedules and structure, but every time he leaned over her shoulder to review a sketch, every time their fingers brushed over a shared coffee cup, she felt the dangerous gravity between them. Knox never pushed, never crossed the line, but his presence lingered like a promise, one she wasn't ready to unpack. She was afraid, afraid that the man who had made her feel safe in one fleeting night could also be the one to destroy her slowly. After all, she'd been told she was too intense, too sensitive, too messy to be loved properly. But with Knox, she didn't feel like a burden. She felt seen. Still, just as the walls began to soften between them, another presence crept in. Vivian Whitmore, the legendary matriarch of Whitmore Holdings, whose heels echoed like thunder and whose stare could slice through steel. She arrived without warning, like a cold gust of wind, her pearls glinting like armor, and her judgment swift and unspoken. From the moment she laid eyes on Ariella, the disapproval was palpable. She didn't speak cruelly. She didn't have to. A single glance, a thin smile, a too polite compliment about Ariella's interesting background said it all. She didn't see Ariella as a woman. She saw her as a problem. Knox's mother had plans, and none of them included a girl from a broken home with a public breakup and paint under her fingernails. But Ariella refused to shrink, refused to let a woman born into power make her feel small. She stood tall during presentations, fought for her ideas in creative briefs, and slowly earned the grudging respect of other executives, though Vivian watched with the cold patience of someone waiting for her to fail. And still, Knox watched it all unfold without stepping in, not out of indifference, but because he trusted Ariella to hold her own. And she did. Until one late evening, as they worked in the glow of city lights and unfinished sketches, their hands accidentally brushed, and the moment cracked open. She looked up, and he looked at her, not as a colleague, not as a consultant, but as a woman he couldn't stop thinking about. For a breathless second, neither spoke. And in that silence, Ariella realized the offer he made wasn't just about art. It was about rewriting both of their lives, and maybe, just maybe, finding something worth holding on to in the chaos. Their fingers had only grazed for a heartbeat, but in that electric pause, Ariella felt something more intimate than a kiss, an unraveling of walls, of boundaries, of all the quiet fears neither of them dared name. From that moment forward, everything shifted. Their partnership turned into proximity, their glances too long, their silences too full. And beneath it all, a fragile bond was growing, blooming in the shadows between shared coffee breaks, late-night design sessions, and elevator rides where breath was the only thing they didn't dare exhale too loudly. But with that closeness came an undeniable truth. Knox Whitmore was not just the polished CEO with a silver tongue and tailored suits. Behind the facade of power was a man shaped by abandonment, disappointment, and a mother whose love was transactional at best. Ariella noticed it first in the way he hesitated before talking about his childhood, how his jaw clenched when family was mentioned, and how every compliment he received felt like a deflection, like he didn't trust good things to stay. Late one night, as they walked side by side through an empty exhibit hall lined with unfinished installations, he finally let the truth slip, not in dramatic confession, but in fragments. A father who walked out when he was 12, leaving nothing but a legacy of absence. A mother who turned grief into cold ambition, grooming him not as a son but as an heir, measuring his worth by headlines, quarterly reports, and how well he mimicked perfection. Ariella listened, not with pity, but with recognition, because she too knew the ache of family that fractured you instead of protecting you. But while Knox revealed his wounds in whispers, Vivian Whitmore was unearthing Ariella's with a scalpel. The woman moved behind the scenes like a ghost with a grudge, hiring private investigators, making quiet calls, pulling strings woven deep in New York's elite. And when she finally struck, it wasn't with a scream, it was with a smile at a charity gala, where she pulled Ariella aside beneath the glow of chandeliers and laid bare everything. The prison records of her father, the court documents from her mother's institutionalization, the grainy photos of their small, chaotic apartment, all presented like a report card of unworthiness. "I admire your strength, dear," Vivian whispered with venom-laced elegance. "But broken girls like you rarely survive in our world. You're beautiful, tragically so, but beauty fades. Damage doesn't." Ariella stood frozen, her champagne flute trembling in her hand, the music around them swelling like mockery. She wanted to scream, to disappear, to fight, but all she could do was blink back tears she refused to let fall in front of that woman. That night, she walked home alone, heels in her hand, throat raw, replaying every word over and over until they became knives lodged in her chest. For a brief moment, she considered quitting everything, walking away from the foundation, from Knox, from the feeling that she might be finally becoming someone worth loving. But before she could run, Knox showed up, on her doorstep in a rain-drenched coat, eyes dark with fury, and something more tender, knowing. She hadn't told him. He just knew. And for once, he didn't speak in careful corporate tones or billionaire bravado. He simply held her, arms strong and steady, and whispered, "You're not broken, Ariella. You're brave. Braver than anyone I've ever met." And with those words, something inside her began to rebuild. Not because he saved her, but because he saw her, all of her, and stayed. Yet as their bond deepened, so did the shadows that followed them. Knox's business rivals began whispering about his sudden obsession with a woman no one had heard of. Tabloids started circling, hungry for scandal, and Vivian grew colder, more calculated, vowing to sever whatever thread connected them before it turned into something permanent. But Ariella was no longer the girl who let other people write her story. She began to fight back, not with vengeance, but with purpose. She poured herself into the foundation, using art to elevate young voices like hers. Every brushstroke, every speech, every exhibit became a rebellion against the idea that her past defined her. Still, every victory brought new eyes, and secrets that had long rested in silence began to stir. Knox, too, had things he hadn't said. Conversations with Preston, connections Ariella hadn't yet uncovered, truths that waited like ghosts behind locked doors. But for now they stood together, battered but not broken, two souls scarred by the people who raised them, holding tight to a fragile truth growing stronger in the spaces where no one else was watching. The world felt quieter near the ocean, as if the sea itself respected the gravity of healing hearts. And when Knox invited Ariella to his private estate perched on the cliffs, it wasn't just for the weekend project. It was something deeper, a shared silence he no longer wanted to carry alone. The house was glass and wood, nestled into the rocks like it had grown there, with sprawling windows that bled sunlight into every room, and the constant lull of waves kissing the shore below. Ariella arrived cautious but curious, the wind playing with the hem of her dress as she stepped out of the car and met his gaze. Softer now, absent of the armor he wore in boardrooms and city lights. They spent the morning reviewing charity installations, hands occasionally brushing over papers, their conversations filled with quiet laughter and the occasional lingering pause that said more than any words could. But as dusk approached and the sky turned honeyed with the golden spill of sunset, something changed, not dramatically, but subtly, like the way shadows shift when you're not looking. On the edge of the cliff where the grass met stone, they stood side by side, the ocean stretching endless before them, and Knox turned to her, not with hunger, but with hope, his voice low as he confessed, "I didn't expect to feel this, but I'd rather be nothing with you than everything with someone else." The sentence lingered in the salt-kissed air, not as a line, but as a truth carved from places he'd never let anyone near. Ariella's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the way it echoed the ache inside her. That quiet longing to matter without conditions. Her fingers found his, slow and uncertain, and she whispered, "You make the silence feel like music." He smiled, not the charming grin the media knew, but the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made her feel like the only person in the world. As twilight deepened, they stepped onto the grassy terrace where soft lanterns swayed in the breeze, casting golden halos that made the night feel sacred. With no music playing, he took her hand and led her into an impromptu dance beneath the stars, their bare feet brushing the cool earth, their laughter echoing softly into the night air. Ariella closed her eyes, feeling his hand settle against the small of her back, guiding her gently, reverently, like she was something fragile and untamed. When he leaned in, he didn't kiss her lips. He kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender it shattered something in her chest. He traced his fingers through her hair like he was memorizing strands, not for ownership, but for comfort, as if every touch was a vow unspoken. They didn't speak of the past or the storms that shaped them. They just moved, danced, existed in a moment that felt like both a beginning and a balm. The fire pit nearby crackled, casting soft warmth as they sat afterward, wrapped in a shared blanket, her head resting on his shoulder, his thumb drawing slow circles on her hand like a lullaby. He didn't press her to explain her scars, and she didn't demand his plans for forever. But in that silence, something bloomed, real, raw, and terrifyingly beautiful. This wasn't lust, wasn't escape, wasn't about filling a void with distraction. It was two broken people learning to breathe in each other's company. Ariella looked at him then, not as the stranger from the bar or the CEO in the spotlight, but as the man who had quietly become the calm she never knew she needed. And in that single, soul-deep heartbeat, she knew. It wasn't just her body she had offered that night in the rain. It had been her heart, unknowingly, irrevocably, and somehow. He had caught it gently, without letting it break. Just as Ariella began to exhale, to let the warmth of Knox's affection melt the last of her guarded edges, the past came crashing back with the cruel precision of a blade cloaked in velvet. Preston. He appeared one gray afternoon outside the gallery, leaning against her apartment door like a ghost dressed in arrogance, wearing a smirk that hadn't aged a day. But this time, he wasn't begging for a second chance. He brought a storm. With casual malice, he claimed that years ago, Knox Whitmore had paid him off to abandon her, to disappear, and leave her heart in ruins, calling it a clean break for someone who was too broken to fix. Her breath caught, her fingers trembled, but she demanded proof. That's when he slid a flash drive across her table, cold, metallic, and humming with danger. The audio clip he played was brief, scratchy, but unmistakable. A voice that sounded like Knox's, calm and commanding, saying things no lover should ever say. That Ariella was fragile, unpredictable, better off without hope. The words twisted around her spine like poison ivy. Preston left with smug satisfaction, knowing he'd dropped a bomb too heavy for any heart to carry. Ariella collapsed onto her couch, the walls closing in, her trust crumbling like brittle paper soaked in gasoline. Could everything have been a lie? Had she been a rehabilitation project all along? Her mind spun through every moment, every touch, every look, every whispered truth beneath the stars, and all of it suddenly felt stained, scripted, suspicious. She couldn't face him, couldn't ask, couldn't bear to hear it from Knox's lips. So she vanished, packed a bag, turned off her phone, deleted her socials, and walked away without goodbye, her heart dragging behind her like a shadow with no light to follow. Knox, blindsided, tore the city apart in silence. His fury was quiet but relentless, canceling meetings, abandoning projects, questioning everyone who had ever been close to Ariella. He searched every cafe, every gallery, even visited her childhood block in Brooklyn, desperate for a trace, a scent, a memory. But all he found were echoes, and the silence she left behind wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Days turned into weeks, and still no word. The woman who had taught him how to breathe in color was now just a ghost on the edge of every morning. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that behind the entire nightmare stood Vivian Whitmore, her lips curved in triumph, her fingers still stained with the ink of forged betrayal. She had orchestrated every second, the return of Preston, the fake recording spliced from older interviews, the whispers fed to tabloids to make Ariella feel like the charity case who'd overstayed her welcome. Because Vivian wasn't afraid of love, she was terrified of what it could cost. Control, legacy, the pristine illusion of the Whitmore empire. She would rather burn her son's happiness to ash than watch him give his heart to a girl who reminded her too much of a life that couldn't be bought. And in the shadows of her empire, as Knox stood fractured and hollow, and Ariella wandered lost in grief and confusion, Vivian believed she had won. But even the most flawless mask begins to crack when it's built on lies, and this storm was far from over. The empire his mother spent decades constructing began to crumble not from scandal or debt, but from the weight of its own deception in a Knox, once the golden son groomed to uphold it, became the one to dismantle it brick by brick when the truth finally carved through the fog like a blade of light. The day he discovered the tampered recordings, the fabricated betrayal, and his mother's cold orchestration of Ariella's disappearance, something inside him snapped. Not with rage, but with a sorrow so profound it hollowed out everything he had once called home. Vivian tried to spin it, to twist her actions into necessity, into protection, but her words rang empty in a heart that had already chosen something real. He didn't yell, he didn't argue. He simply walked away, first from her, then from the boardrooms, the towering buildings, the manicured reputation that had never belonged to him in the first place. He sold off Whitmore's most ruthless subsidiaries, redirected millions toward mental health initiatives, art rehabilitation programs, and community grants, quietly without press releases or fanfare. And in the heart of it all, he built a foundation named after the woman who had taught him how to feel again, the Ariella Monroe Initiative for Creative Healing. It wasn't for redemption, it was gratitude, love, a whisper to the world that she had mattered more than legacy, more than lineage, more than image. Meanwhile, far from city skylines and broken promises, Ariella found solace in a coastal town where no one knew her name, where she could paint without pressure, speak without performance, and finally learn to trust her own voice again. The salt in the air, the colors in her brush, and the silence of healing became her sanctuary. But even peace couldn't erase him. Knox haunted her canvases, the blue of his eyes in every sky she painted, the curve of his jaw hidden in every silhouette. And just when she thought she had imagined him too vividly, turned him into a memory instead of a man, she turned in her small studio one afternoon, paint on her fingers and heart still raw. And there he was. No tailored suit, no entourage, no empire lingering behind him like armor. Just Knox, vulnerable, steady, and heartbreakingly human. She didn't speak at first, couldn't. The weight of his gaze, the tenderness in his stance, the quiet reverence with which he stood in the doorway undid her. But he crossed the room slowly, holding nothing but the truth. "I don't need a company," he said, voice soft but unwavering. "I just need you. I finally chose love over legacy." And in that moment, the weight she'd carried alone began to lift, her doubts unraveling like the seams of an old wound finally ready to close. Her throat tightened as she whispered, "I never stopped believing in us." They didn't rush into each other's arms. They didn't collapse into a dramatic embrace. Instead, they stood inches apart, tears blurring her vision, breath shared in stillness. And then, finally, their lips met in a kiss that was neither wild nor desperate. It was slow, intentional, the kind of kiss that spoke in apologies and promises, in every word they had never been brave enough to say. A kiss that didn't demand, but healed, soft and sacred, like pressing gold into the cracks of a once broken heart. In that moment, nothing else existed. No betrayal, no history, no empire. Just two people, stitched back together by the very love the world had tried so hard to tear apart.